Hi everybody, my name is Brady and I'm a 19th century American historian and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be finishing Extra History's World War I Christmas Truce videos. This is part 2 and we're doing the letters from the trenches. That seems like a good time. I wasn't sure what we were going to do when we were getting towards the end of the previous one, and then I looked it up. Oh, we're doing letters from the trenches. That only makes sense. The other one, for lack of better terms, seemed more like an overhead view of things, and letters would give us more of a nitty-gritty view. I like that. I think that's cool. I love reading old letters. One thing that I think is so much better in the 20th century is reading letters. Reading letters from the 19th century is just... sometimes it's just kind of a pain. Sometimes the way they write, even when they're trying to be humorous, it's just not as enjoyable, I guess. Even though I really love my area of study, I'd imagine this is actually going to be a little bit more fun than reading letters from my area of study, at least on an individual level, rather than how they fit into the grander narrative, which I find a whole lot of amusement from in my own area of study. But I've talked too much. Let's get it started.
This was a letter to a German newspaper in December of 1914. Yesterday there was a fierce and terrible onslaught of Christmas packages into our trenches. No man was spared. In the confusion, one soldier suffered a salami impaled straight into his stomach. Another had raisins from an exploding pastry fly directly into his eyes. A third had the misfortune of having a bottle of cognac fly into his mouth.
Like, this is what I'm talking about. It's just so much more fun because I can relate so much more to that kind of humor than the humor of people from the 19th century. I know this is early 20th century, but it's like night and day sometimes with what you can read. Like, yeah, of course, there's funny people from the 19th century. It's just a different kind of humor.
This little holiday special is brought to you by World of Tanks.
Yay!
Use the invite code ARMISTICE if you're a new player who wants to check out the game. World War I was a letter-writing war, one where pencil and paper were a soldier's line of communication with friends and family, and reading those letters provides some insight into what life was like in those trenches. So today, let's read some excerpts from those soldiers' holiday letters.
This is something that I think people in the 20th century have that I'm kind of jealous of in a lot of ways. They have such an abundance of letters, especially if you cover some of the more Western countries. You tend to get a decent amount of letters. There's some things that I've tried studying when it came to the Russians, when I just recently had to take a class on Russian history. It not only was hard to find letters from that were translated that I could read, but letters from the soldiers in general were a little bit more scarce. And the literacy or cultural difference, I don't know what it was, but I really do appreciate the amount of primary sources you have to work with during this time, typically.
Now, of course, none of us at Extra Credits have ever experienced being deployed over the holidays. So, real quick, I want to hand the mic over to somebody who has. Here is Wargaming's military specialist, Richard Cutland, back again to give us a little insight.
In my 30 years of service, I was extremely fortunate to only spend around 6 Christmases away from home and family. The first was spent lying in a muddy ditch in Northern Ireland, where we'd been ordered to set up an observation post to watch the comings and goings of a known IRA terrorist. Cold, wet, hungry and tired, watching someone else celebrate Christmas with family and friends. It was certainly a low point for us all. As a young soldier, the easiest thing to do was not think about it. It was merely another day amongst a multitude of other days. The real heartbreak occurred after marriage and children. It was wrenching to explain why Daddy would not be there on such a special day. Tales of helping Santa at the North Pole or having to feed the reindeer quickly wore thin as my children grew older and wiser. A soldier's wife has much to contend with, and my own wife's angst and worry during any operational tour was compounded when I was away for the holidays.
This is such a real thing. And I've, of course, never really experienced anything like this. I wasn't deployed. My family wasn't deployed. I guess my grandfather was deployed, but I wasn't around at the time. But I've known people when I was younger who've had their family members sent overseas during, and it's like a different level of war too. This is World War One, and today it's just a totally different world. So the comparison is hard to make, but the anxiety is undeniable, and I think it transcends time. I guess no matter what time you look into, these are similar anxieties that people will have.
The armies always tried their best if circumstances allowed. If you were near a headquarters, the chefs would knock up a Christmas dinner with all the trimmings. Well, perhaps not all, but they did their best with what was available. Unfortunately, sitting with 100 men wearing paper hats was not quite the same as Christmas dinner with your family. Yet we were all aware it's necessary to spend such periods away. And let's face it, it was part of the job. But it was always a killer to be told that a deployment was imminent and Christmas would be cancelled. So to all those servicemen and women who find themselves away for this very special time, I salute you and wish you and your families peace and happiness.
Thank you, Richard. Now let's set the scene. It's
That was
Boxing Day,
tasteful.
1914, and Private Henry Williamson is writing home about the most extraordinary Christmas of his life. I'm writing from the trenches. In my mouth is a pipe presented by the Princess Mary. In the pipe is tobacco. Well, of course, you say. But wait, in the pipe is German tobacco from a German soldier. Yes, a live German soldier from his own trench. On Christmas Eve, both armies sang carols and cheered, and there was very little firing. The Germans called to our men to come and fetch a cigar, and our men told them to come to us. This went on for some time until a bold Tommy crept out and stood between the trenches.
This is such a cool, and it's so weird. I wonder how many of these letters are like touched up a little bit, because when I read a lot of original letters from people who are like not like nobles and these like highly educated types, there are like spelling errors and all that stuff to contend with, and I wonder if the versions he's reading are edited in any capacity. I'm sure you're going to find plenty of people out there who are just decent writers, because literacy is much better than it used to be in this time. I mean, literacy generally gets better over time, but it makes me wonder. I know I've read plenty of these letters during slightly earlier stages of my education when I wasn't as interested in history. I was kind of a late bloomer. I wish I paid attention more when it mattered. I guess it matters now. I guess it all matters, but I wish I paid attention the whole time and knew where I was going. But, yeah, I remember reading some stuff, and I was like, oh, spelling error, idiot, dumb. It like that's what my head's thinking, but it's also like, I can't spell anything coherent without spell check.
And a Saxon came to meet him. They shook hands and laughed. Thus the ice was broken. Our men are speaking to them now. German Corporal Joseph Wenzel was similarly amazed at the gathering, writing, "What I believed to be madness several hours ago, I could see now with my own eyes. Bavarians and English, until then the greatest of enemies, shook hands, talked, and exchanged items. A single star stood still in the sky directly above them, interpreted by many as a special sign from heaven. More and more joined, and the entire line greeted each other. For the rest of my life, I shall never forget this scene,
I talked about this a little bit in the previous video, how in America, war is so foreign to us, in the sense that for so long, when people go off to war, they are going off to war. We don't really fight on the homeland. That doesn't really happen anymore. And a lot of you talked in the comments about how a lot of you who watch are European. I think you make up a pretty significant chunk. I haven't checked the analytics in a while, but it's significant. You've talked about how your countries really still have the scars from the war. And I can imagine that stories like this might hit you differently from how they hit me. Like, it feels really good to hear a slightly positive story in an otherwise awful event that never should have happened. But I could only imagine what it's like to really have come up in these places and had that, and especially with World War I. Americans are kind of detached from World War I. We hopped on very late. We at least have a little bit more attachment to World War II.
Goes to show that human feelings continue to go on, even if, in these times, men do not know anything but killing and murdering. But not everybody held fire. British rifleman John Erskine's unit was fraternizing in no man's land when a soldier, disobeying his officer's order, shot one of the Germans.
Oh,
He writes,
what a...
The Germans
Oh.
immediately replied, and instead of firing
Rightfully
on where the
so.
shot came from, they fired at the first person they saw. Unfortunately, this happens to be one of our corporals, who was shot through the head. A most regrettable fact connected with the affair was that he has 3 brothers in the battalion, and it must have had a disheartening effect on them.
So this is all the same stories that he told us in the first part, pretty much, just kind of in a more down-to-earth way, because they're being told through the writings of the people who actually experienced, rather than being filtered through anybody else's mouth. I actually really appreciate that he's doing it this way. And this has got to be, in a sense, to do videos like this consistently, sounds like a really cool idea, to tell a story and then do another part where you really take it to the primary sources. That seems like such a good idea. In this case, it's probably a little bit more manageable than some other subjects, but I think it's really cool.
The Germans apologized, but it left a black mark on the day. Still, in many places, the peace held, until the generals ended it with artillery. The spirit of the Christmas truce would be rekindled the following year, albeit on a small scale. In December of 1915, French soldier Louis Barthes found himself in a spontaneous ceasefire when heavy rain forced both sides to abandon their trenches. He wrote, Frenchmen and Germans looked at each other and saw that they were all men, no different from one another. They smiled, exchanged comments. Hands reached out and grasped. We shared tobacco, a canteen of coffee, or Pinard. One day, a huge devil of a German stood up on a mound and gave a speech, which only the Germans could understand word for word, but everyone knew what it meant because he smashed his rifle on a tree stump, breaking it in 2. Applause broke out on both sides.
Hey, that's something there. I hope he didn't get punished for that. But yeah, that's really cool. Little demonstrations like that, things that transcend language, are always the coolest thing to learn about. Because when I was always thinking about this, when you have these people interacting, like, how many of them really understand each other? But I've met a lot of people who I don't share a language with, but you kind of work it out. A lot of gestures, big movements with the hands, and whatever it takes to communicate things. So I guess language barriers can be worked around, I guess. Sometimes.
Meanwhile, our big shot leaders were in a furor. What in the Lord's name would happen if the soldiers refused to kill each other? German soldier Airman Bauer, also present, was thinking much the same. He wrote, The infantry does not shoot anymore, just the crazy artillery. The masters make war, they have a quarrel, and the workers, the little men, have to stand there fighting against each other. Is that not a great stupidity? Once again, senior officers broke the truce with artillery and court-martial threats. The fighting began again, and Barthes would spend 3 more Christmases at war. The same was true for many others. In fact, Christmas of 1916 brought Canadian infantryman John McLean his first taste of combat. He wrote, Dear Mother, I haven't written for over a week now, but I couldn't very well. We went into the trenches on Christmas Eve and were in for 6 days. It was not too bad at all, far better than I expected. All our fellows came out fine, except Jack Ivner, who got a machine gun bullet through the leg. The noise was awful, but a person will get used to that after a while. I spent Christmas Day in a dugout. If I live to be 300 years old, I will never forget this Christmas week. One night, I was going up a trench, and I saw a big gray cat sitting on the parapet. I'd like to tell you more, but I can do that when I get home. Now you are doing too much worrying. We are all right if a man is careful. A month later, he was dead.
Jeez. And when you read that stuff, you wonder how much of it is true. Like, how much is being covered up, in a sense. I don't think that this guy is lying necessarily, but what is being omitted here? Because war is hell. It's a cliche, but war is hell, and I wonder how much he's perhaps sparing the feelings of the person he's writing home to. Because I'd imagine with a lot of these writings, you always have to consider that. Because what do they want the people at home to think? Are they trying to spare their feelings? Are they trying to give an accurate representation of their suffering? Are they trying to make a point? And that's always got to be considered, no matter who your no matter who your narrator is.
Meanwhile, another Canadian, Jack Davey, was having a bittersweet Christmas. He had come home after months in a POW camp, only to find himself at a military hospital in Toronto, thousands of miles from his new fiancée. He wrote to her on Boxing Day, "Darling Kitty, many thanks for the letter and the card with Christmas wishes. We had quite a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. It's quite a novelty to see a real white Christmas. Yesterday was a lovely day. On the whole, I had a good time, but I hope next year won't be such a disappointment for us, sweetheart. Surely this rotten luck of being separated at Christmas can't go on forever. 1 week has passed since I was measured for my leg. I wish that I could have it by the new year so I could start the year on both feet again. It will soon be 2 years since I walked like a human being. It seems a long time to talk about it, but I can picture those fields and imagine I can see the exact spot where I fell, as though it only happened yesterday. I guess it'll be a long day before I forget it. But I hope that all the dark days are behind us now, sweetheart. We just have to be happy and live long to make up for it all." As the war ended and the veterans trickled home, that is exactly what they tried to do. Yet their holidays spent in the shadow of dugouts would never fully leave them. There are so many letters like these. Honestly, deciding which ones to include was the hardest part. But if this happened to capture your imagination, try something later. If you go home for the holidays, or if you happen to already be there, ask your relatives if they have any old letters lying around. It's possible that the next story from the trenches might come from your own family. Happy holidays, everybody. We'll see you next year.
And that will become a progressively rarer thing over time, obviously, as the older generation dies off. I mean, there's not a lot of veterans left from... I'm not sure how many people are left from, perhaps... I'm trying to think. How many people could be left from maybe World War II at this point? They're really old at this. I don't think... Can't be many. There must be numbers on this stuff. I really liked that little last point, though. I've always thought about looking a little bit more into my personal family history. I've talked about my grandfather who served in Korea, and I don't know a whole lot about that. I was pretty young for most of the time he was around, and he had... It feels like a dozen brothers. Most of which also served, and I'd imagine, though it's a different conflict, I'd imagine there's a lot of history to be found in a lot of their old stuff, which I'm sure is still around somewhere. I don't know if I'd ever be able to have access to it, but it is a thing. I remember when he passed, I was given a little box of trinkets, and they were various pins and stuff, and this is before I knew I was going to be like big into history, but it seemed like a natural thing to give to me because I was a little better at like the social studies stuff than most other stuff. So there were pins and stuff. There was like an old lighter that I thought that was cool, his old dog tags and stuff. I could only imagine what else is there that I've not checked out. Of course, it's not in the box I was given. It was a little box, but I'm sure he has plenty of stuff still laying around somewhere. So maybe I should look into that someday. Maybe. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up. I would be doing a thumb if I didn't have my hand occupied right now. A thumbs up. Subscribe, and I'll be seeing you tomorrow with another video. I'm not sure what it'll be. But I'm getting things back in order here. I found a space. I'm getting used to recording here, and I actually like it. My chair is more comfortable than the old one. The old one was falling apart. I was being held up by basically a piece of cardboard. So this is much better. So thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.